brief intro. And
yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So like the lingering 5 minutes. Close. I think we're gonna start our in-person human experience. Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. And audio-wise, there's no mic, so if anyone has trouble hearing, don't feel shy about moving up. And we're going to do our best to record it through QuickTime, but if the file gets huge, don't count on it. Take notes, draw, come up with ideas. So my name is John Cassura, by the way, for those who don't know. I'm on the faculty in graphic design. And I have the pleasure of introducing the second in our third speaker series, which is Upstatement. And I just wanted to point out Nancy Stolas and Mingtown Kim, who helped organize the series. And there's not an overarching theme to the speaker series this spring, although we were interested in collaborative studios, interdependence, product and software, and what it means to give a lecture today, kind of in this network communication. We often teach to extend an invitation that would build on our individual teaching and professional interests. I teach a course that looks at the intersection of design and politics. They seem to have organized themselves in one area here. And for a few years, I've also been designing political campaigns, local political campaigns. And so I became aware of Upstatement's work when I saw the Michelle Wu for Boston Mayor campaign, which was just last year in 2021. That was done by Upstatement, and so I looked into their work. I found that campaign vibrant, expressive, systematic, but human, and it worked. She actually won and became the first person of color, first woman, first Asian American elected to serve as the mayor of Boston. So if you go up to Boston, you can thank in part the work of Upstatement. And that campaign I found to be representative of Upstatement's work more generally. Equal parts idealism, social good, systems thinking, a respect for audience and public, real communication, and a well-crafted visual language. There's actually designers doing what we know how to do and love up there. And actually they're distributed companies, so I think they're everywhere now, but founded in Boston. So we'll learn more about all of that today. And we're lucky to have Andy Pressman representing them, who is here from Portland, Oregon. And he graduated from Cooper Union in 2003, and in 2008 co-founded Rumors Studio, a design studio for print and screen. While still with Rumors, he became Verso Books' first design director. They are still producing quite a bit, and you should check out their work on the site. And he oversaw that until 2019. And he's now the creative director at Upstatement, and they're based in Boston, as I mentioned. So welcome, Andy.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm genuinely really excited to be here in person as a person. I will try to broadcast to the back. Sometimes I have a booming voice, and sometimes I think to myself as an aside, and if I do too much of the latter, please stop me. So I am here to talk a bit about some of the things that John brought up sort of loosely and sideways. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Michelle Wu campaign. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work at Upstatement and previously. I've actually been at Upstatement now for about a year. Most of my professional experience has been in different contexts. So some of what I'm talking about has been gleaned in conversation with my colleagues now to learn about how they took on some of these projects. So some of this was actually a chance for me to understand a little bit about their thinking. In some ways, this, though, is a talk in kind of two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is to think about interactive design for meaning. And as an aside for brands, or at least for branding, there's little that we do that is for brands in the sense that one might come to mind when you think of the word, but there's a lot to do with the idea of branding and meaning. You're also the first, this is like the start of a bigger talk. You're the first room I've delivered any of this to. So this is Upstatement's current website. I'm showing it partly as like a scene setter, but also to note that at Upstatement we talk a bit about being a digital product studio with an editorial mindset. And I think that editorial part is really important. It's important not just for the studio as a way to think about its work, but it's important for people who approach us to think about what we do and how we do it. As an editor, we're thinking a lot about stories, and we're thinking a lot about content. And I think one thing that sets Upstatement's work apart from some of the other studios or agencies, certainly of scale, is this idea that like you design for meaning. You design around the content. And in some ways that feels a little bit funny to think about in the context of branding, because sometimes those things are at odds, like actual content and meaning versus a sort of like personality. But I think there are ways that those two things overlap or touch one another. But before I talk about Upstatement's work, to give you a sense of where I come from, I ran a studio called Rumors, as was mentioned, in New York. Our work was geared in many of the same directions as Upstatement's work, but a little bit smaller, frankly. We were like 6 people, always. We were one team. Upstatement is almost 50. We got into the work, I got into the work through print. I was a print designer. I had a website when I was super young, but at a certain point when I was thinking about design, I mostly thought about like print and system design. I started out being a book designer. This is a series for Verso that I still do. This is now like what feels like 20 years later, called Radical Thinkers, which was this attempt to, Verso has this really deep catalog. They've been producing books since like the '68, right? And they wanted to repackage a lot of those books. They wanted to do it in a way that was sort of efficient, but had a unique approach. And so we've designed this system that like could kind of adapt itself to tell a story loosely about the content. I was mostly interested in design illustration, maybe, that didn't actually explain anything and that instead sort of like complicated the content. It was more evocative, maybe, rather than literal. And at a certain point with Verso, who had never had a design director, and they frankly didn't really know what to do with designers, I said, you should hire me as your design director. And they did. And so I took some of those same ideas that I was working on with that series and brought it to the press. It was really a satisfying experience to work with all these remarkable young designers who I think, for the most part at that point, had not yet found outlets that were putting out their design work. This is stuff over the past 15 years. I had the chance to work with Eric Carter and Eric Hu and Jessica Svensson, Jennifer Daniel, and other people who I now count as friends or colleagues who had an approach to design that I thought was like an aggressive typographic intervention. I don't know, I struggle. It's something along those lines. I'll figure that one out later. At a certain point, we had been doing more digital work. Even as I was doing that stuff, one of my colleagues, Renda Morton, with whom I co-founded Rumors, she had a digital background. And so we started taking on more websites. In part, this was an economic fact. Like 2008, you see this obvious collapse in the economy. Groups are shifting their budget away from printed matter towards the digital, where they could do sort of more with less, right? Like you could run X number of mailers for like $10,000 each over the course of a year, or you could spend $15,000 on a small website, and that was where your entire budget would go for the course of the year. So already my work was being, not already, everybody's work is being like driven by the sort of the market that you exist within, right? The like economic pressure pushes in that direction, but I found that I loved it. I really enjoyed thinking about how to take an idea and how to translate it into an interactive space. So for Verso, a lot of what we were working with was about pulling things away. We had no graphics, it was all type or CSS. The only imagery was the covers, and the covers were shot as physical objects to emphasize their objectness in a sort of explicit, almost antagonistic stance towards like Amazon's dematerialization of stuff, where everything is just this perfect little thumbnail. Similarly, at this time, I was art directing a magazine called Badoon. Badoon magazine is sort of both. A magazine about Middle Eastern art and culture, which took the stance that sort of fundamentally the Western perspective on this part of the world is, it's wildly skewed, but also like it is impossible to like grasp the thing and to declare it is this. It is many things. It is too big to say that it is this one thing. And so the magazine got redesigned with every issue, like re-thematized, built up from the ground to the top, new grid, new type. et cetera, that was wildly labor intensive and inefficient, and it was a delight. But then thinking about like how do you translate that to the web became a bit of a challenge, because you cannot reasonably expect a website that is being run on a kind of constant basis to be ripped apart and rebuilt every 4 months. Like there's inefficient and then there's just bananas. And so what we try to do is think like, how can we take that same spirit and translate it into this interactive space? And we did it through imagery, where it's more fluid. We use these images to like disrupt and recontextualize the content. So on Hover, the whole thing gets taken over. There are these big disruptive moments. There's still this like layering effect. It had all these Baduni traits, and it could be something that changed as you used it, but it was also still very formatted. It's very templated, even though it gets to be very flashy and elusive and sort of ever-changing. The final project I'm going to show from Rumors was the first thing we did where there was not, where we weren't translating a sort of like printed thing into a digital thing, but instead we were trying to build something that lived in both those spaces at the same time. So this is an exhibition at the Canadian Centre for Architecture called Error 404. The object is not online. The exhibition was about the way that digital objects, digital objects, okay, are represented physically, and vice versa, that the physical is turned into the digital. It was a large space. In the center of the main room was this big table on which you had different items that were trying physically to display digital information. There was also some screens around that did the opposite. One of the things that we thought a bit about was like, well, how do you build a website for this exhibition? When fundamentally, right, the purpose of the exhibition was the idea of representing things digitally. So what we wanted to do was build an experience that like completed the cycle, that told the story in a tight way. So this takes a bit of explaining. On the left is the website, which had a top-down webcam, a live webcam, of the exhibition space. On the right is the exhibition space. As the users online navigated the website, you put your cursor over something and this like boop would appear, their cursor is being projected into the real space. So people there saw these like ghosts of interaction, but knowing that this was the thing itself, that both these spaces were actual and real. That the website wasn't just a like ancillary representation, that it was as fundamental to the experience as the physical space, that you couldn't separate the two. Okay. So in all of this, for me, the exciting thing is thinking about how interactive design offers meaning and idea through the things that only interactive design can do. To talk about that, taking one step back, I want to talk first about sort of my approach to thinking about visual design. And I am very much of the idea that design is an editorial practice. I happen not to be an artist. I mean, I could just state that. I don't think of my practice as an artist practice. I think of it more like a translator, where my work is something that like is the intermediary step between an idea and a form, or an idea and an experience, and that's really how I approach design, broadly speaking. When I was a student, all of this was still, for the most part, about like the printed matter that existed in the world, the ephemera. Most of what I encountered, I used to think about my work or the work of my peers on the spectrum of surface and system. So surface is this like painterly expression. It is about the way that something is seen, and it is offering meaning to the viewer through style and reference. Style is meaning, right, of a certain kind. Style is like a kind of coded language that some people can read. It was gesturing at these things through the surface. And then the other end of the spectrum is system. And system builds meaning through organization and relationship and operation and logic. And even as I'm saying this now, I want to stress, these aren't like binaries. Like it's not like you did this or this. And even like, I mean, the Vignelli subway map, right, is not just system. Like that is there's surface expression there, there's color, there's joy in the decision making, but fundamentally the meaning comes from the systematic approach. So what happened was, as I started to do more interactive work, I realized that there was this other point, so to speak, within this flow. And that's behavior. And that behavior in the context of interactive work is what allows for a unique kind of interactive meaning. Regardless of what you're building, behavior is what we respond to in a unique way within interactive work. It is the way something is experienced over time, the way a design is used. These things are what set interactive design apart. I'll wait for this to play out. One of the fun things about this, I was doing this, is I was like, I want to write a thing. Ha ha ha, how much fun. I'll write about my TV show that I love. And I saved it, and I immediately went back, and it was like within maybe 30 seconds had been re-edited. Like, that's how fast they are. That's incredible. Anyway, the decisions that are being made in the design here, we don't necessarily think about the like design of Wikipedia. But moving beyond the very like stripped down, I think there's the term like brutalist, like language of the blue and the text, are these like decisions they make about how they treat messaging and language and timing and sparseness that like drive you to understand the way that it works. And thinking about the way that Wikipedia works became something that for me was really exciting. Because behavior is the defining trait of interactive design. Behavior contributes directly to meaning in a way that it doesn't in non-interactive design. And I left a note for myself here. I'm gonna drink some water. Interactive design, not just digital design. So like, I say that by saying a book is interactive. You know, you open the book, you turn the page, you move through it over time, it has certain behavior, the paper has material quality. But for the most part, we've like already, that's been codified. The way that the book, the codex, right, works is pretty codified. We all know how it works. But it works that way, and in fact, probably novels are what they are today because of the codex. Like that structure, that interactive behavior set up all kinds of things that it's like every time you make a decision about the way that something behaves, you're inventing a new law of physics. And like sometimes that gesture can be really dramatic and sometimes it can be very small, but it changes the way that experience occurs and that you derive meaning from that experience. I think a little bit about behavior in terms of meaning when I think about products, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. But so here's two, on the face of it, similar products. On the left is Pinterest, on the right is Arena. You're probably familiar with both. Pinterest is aggressive in its like ephemeral stupidity. I don't know how to put it. So like I joined Pinterest and it's like, what's your gender? How old are you? And I'm like, I am male, I'm 42. And it's like, you must like basketball and animals. And Arena's like, hi, what are you doing? These are two fundamentally different experiences. And they tell me different things about what I meant to do in this space, even though, on a very basic level, very, very similar. I grab a photo, I save a photo. You go inside and like, okay, so we talk about brand and meaning, or I'm going to talk about brand and meaning. Very similar. They're on white. There's black sands. There's some gray. There's images seen. But the language they used, the structure and the pace, the way that time works here, fundamentally different. And it creates a different culture. And a different like culture is allowed to emerge within that. Okay. Taking a slight step to the side, I'm going to talk a bit more about upstatement. At upstatement, we think a lot about this as we design. And, I mentioned the editorial mindset. We're thinking a lot about what the meaning of the thing is and how best to convey it. And sometimes you're conveying that through the look and feel, right? You're making surface decisions, or you're conveying it through organization, you're making system decisions. But often, because it's interactive, we're making behavioral decisions. We're thinking about the way that system and surface converge on behavior and change the experience. So at upstatement, this is partly like salesy, frankly, it's a business. They refer to this brand through digital. I think partly it's storytelling, but partly it's about like, okay, brand means a lot of different things. It has a lot of different contexts. I'm going to use it today, and you're going to hear the word a bunch. I was practicing this talk, in front of my wife, Danielle, who is not a designer. And she is like, I never want to hear the word brand again. And I sympathize. I also kind of don't. But I'm saying it here because we can share the meaning between us. Brand is about an expression of self. Now, what that self is, sometimes that self is corporate personhood, but sometimes that self is like you are a person existing in the world, contributing stuff into this ecology of like information. You cannot help but be a brand. So the idea of branding is to like acknowledge that and do it with intent. Branding and meaning making work differently on the screen than in print because for these digital first brands, behavior equals meaning. It is the same. You cannot like experience a thing and not have that color your understanding of what the thing is. Just really superficial. At some point, historically, brands were obviously physical. I mean, that was pretty much all we had, right? Everything was physical. You would have had storefronts and consumer goods and printed matter and ephemera and this stuff you'd receive and you'd hold and you'd be like, the brand of Apple. Brands were consumed in that sense, right? You received and you sort of burned through it. But the brand ecosystem is mostly online now. I'm sorry, I actually should not have. This is nauseating to me. I should probably skip this slide, but now I'm just fascinated by it when I watch it. The decisions that they're making here about there's all this like designy junk. There's big type, there's big color, there's splashy moments, right? But the brand of this, the idea of this, is not about any of these things. It's about the fact that when you scroll, you're controlling it. Like that is the Apple gesture. And I think what they're trying to say is like, look, even you, in your like use of this thing, can make these remarkable experiences. Like it is not so much about the image, it is about your control and your diving into the image. That about that experience is the message that they're trying to gesture forward. All this stuff is taking place online. I mean, there's hardware, and I don't want to like dismiss that, but there is hardware. But it's like, there's a reason I think that we refer to some brands as like, I'm just gonna go past this, sorry, as Instagram brands, like the Instagram pot or whatever. Partly they advertise on Instagram, but partly that's the like ecosystem it lives in. It lives in this shared space of like people cooking and taking photos of themselves cooking and sharing those photos of themselves cooking more than it does in the actual world. Like so much of how we encounter things right now is in this space. The ecosystem for these things are all entirely online, right? These are brands without physical products. One thing I think about a lot is like weather apps. Small weather apps, small interactive like weathery things, for the most part, are getting their data from the same sources. They haven't all set up their own network of like distributed barometers or whatever. They are taking from a number of data sets. So how do you differentiate a weather app? You differentiate it through the behavior of that app, not through the content in this instance, but through the experience of that content. This is like a funny weather app. There's others. There's cool weather apps. There's minimal weather apps. But all these things, the only way that this thing differentiates itself within a marketplace is through that experience. With digital experiences, what you're offering, that like use of the thing, right? You're using the brand. Like in its use, it's one and the same. Like these things are so tied together. It's not so much about like the world that it puts out. It is about that moment of use within the digital space. So to talk a bit more about that and then to tie this back to some upstatement-y work, I'm going to talk about 3 things that Upstatement has done. Again, I'm going to note, I didn't work on any of these, but I find them each very interesting. So at Upstatement, a little bit of inside, like here's how it works. We have this structure that is divided, there's about 55 people right now, divided into 4 what's called practice areas. Editorial, product, enterprise, which really just means like big website, and brand. And brand is the smallest of these in terms of the number of people who participate in it, and in terms of the products that come, or the jobs that come to our door and say like, this is a branding job. In part, though, this is because we treat brand like this. Like it is the space that all these other things operate within. No matter what you're doing, you are developing an idea about something. And that idea is the brand. So I'm going to talk a bit about MIT first, which was the first of those images we saw. MIT has had a website since like forever. I remember this. It's actually, I'm not going to lie, this is really good. That's a really good website. It rendered really well on my screen. It is flexible, it gets to the point. I think they did some good things here. In between this and whatever Upstatement did, some bad things, but that's okay. The thing about MIT's web world is that there's just a ton of it. You had students and faculty and classes and organizations all making their own distributed websites, all like running their own unique servers. It was endless. It had been going on for so long. It's also MIT. Like that's just part of what it does. You don't want to like erase this history. You don't want to erase the presence of these things. You want to sort of embrace it. At the same time, though, you want to think about like, how do I make sense of it? So thinking about this, we realized that like, okay, that idea of all that distributed stuff, like that sort of fundamentally is the idea of MIT's web presence. And that how do we lean into it became the question. How do we do something with that distributed collection? We wanted them basically to be what they were and what they were already doing, but with intent. So I'm going to show the team that worked on it. I'm going to try to do this for each of these things. You'll see that we have designers and engineers, or at least here, collapsed. That's because historically, this is changing, but historically, at Upstatement, the designers also were the engineers. They also coded. I myself am not an engineer, and I'm part of a sort of change, I think, in the way that it considers its approach. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next project. One thing that's interesting to me, when I was a student thinking about doing design work at scale, so much research. There's so much more research than I ever gave time for as a student. Like the amount of like walking and talking and interviewing and collecting of data that I do, and then synthesizing all that into like a strategy, it's just an enormous amount of my work. Very little of my work, honestly, is sitting down and designing. So much of my work is everything else around that. Anyway, so this is just a brief moment of some snapshots of how we conducted research. Partly the challenge here is like it's a university. There's only so much you're going to get from like raw surveys. You want to go and just speak to people and see people. That has been a challenge, especially over the past 2 years, but this was prior to the collapse of everything. So given the depth of all that material within MIT, and how different each user's needs were, part of what you're getting from research is figuring out, like, holy shit, there's like 20 different big, chunky, segmented audiences. And within that, there's 20 different types of users. And within that, you have to think about, like, what about the person who's trying to find a thing on their phone? Will they, like, hold a child in one hand? Like, there's so many different discrete challenges to address. Part of what we're trying to do is figure out how do you do something that can emphasize everything. So what we did was search. We emphasized search. We effectively like stripped out the top layer of the website and put in an incredibly fast search mechanism. That's the gut. That really is the website at this point. There's also, though, this desire to allow people some control of that. Like nobody really other than, I guess, what is it, the Yale grad program, nobody really wants their website to be like truly out of their control. They want to be able to surface things. So we built these spotlights that allowed editors and teachers within MIT to create these moments of interest. So when you go to the website, you see this. On the left is search, on the right is a spotlight. And again, that search is everything, and that search tells a story. The fact that search is the thing that is given such prominence says to you, like, there's a depth here that I need to dig into. There's an opportunity that I can partake in by like searching for a term. By making that decision, by addressing it that way, it changes the meaning of the website. It changes the like experience of the content, obviously, but that experience, it tells a story about what MIT is. Everything else is really like straight-faced, right? It's like you do want information, but like you just try to get that information as clearly as possible and drive people into that search. There's one other thing that I wanted to mention, talking about behavior as a way to convey meaning. That also, I think, includes messaging and tone, like the way that you speak and what you say is something that we think a lot about. With MIT, there's this opportunity to say, like, okay, this is an editorial approach. Like, by maintaining this voice, you are maintaining a consistency, and people understand, like, there's an MIT there. It is not, someone was explaining this on a call to me the other day, and I was like, oh, that's such a great way to put it. Like, imagine that you had a really good friend with whom you talked very frequently. And then one day they like sent you a text message and it was just bananas. Like it did not sound like it was in their voice. It was like, I'm in whatever, I need money from you. And you're like, clearly this has been hacked. There's this like analogy to the way that an organization speaks, which is that you expect it to have a voice and a tone. I think that's something that maybe doesn't get addressed as much early on in a designer's career, that I have come to see as important as the work that I do is as the visual surface is the language that gets used within that, the way that it speaks. Okay, Michelle Wu. This is a really interesting project. Okay, so I talked earlier about the way that teams blur a little bit, and I'll talk probably more about that in the next one. But 6 weeks, I think, was all they had. God, I feel like I'm talking about like the Apollo mission. Like, look at these heroes. 6 weeks was all they had. And so in 6 weeks, there's not time for that research. Like I showed those, the images of people like walking around talking to MIT. Here it's like nothing. Like you don't get surveys, you don't get that deep dig. You get a few phone calls with people from within Michelle Wu's organization, and that's it. And what's so interesting here is that unlike the majority of campaigns that are well funded, the campaign was not being run with the help of well-paid consultants, usually consultants. The campaign was being run by volunteers. It was mostly a volunteer-run campaign. It was like a smaller political campaign being run at a large scale. And so much of what had to be done was figure out a way to create a voice that everyone could use, because there wasn't a design team. Michelle had some ideas about, she has her own taste in color, and there's a certain like expression and quality to the way that she speaks, but there's also a kind of idea about politics and about ground-up politics that she wanted to exhibit. And so the language that emerged was one that was very it felt like signs at a campaign, right? That you could have that woo, had to accommodate various colors and languages. This big, expressive, big punch. Okay, as a design idea, came very, very quickly. The challenge wasn't how are we going to design the campaign? The challenge is what are you going to do with it? How do you then make use of this language? It's not enough to say here it is, here you go. What you need to figure out is how can you make it real given the reality of the network that she had to rely on. So what we built was, rather than usually in a campaign, you have very top-down policing of stuff, policing of the design, policing of the messaging, and instead this was a campaign that was turned into a toolkit that was open sourced. Anybody could access it. The next step beyond that, because I think that's important, but the next step was okay, but also how do we create a thing that people can adapt and make use of if they themselves are not professional designers with, obscenely expensive Adobe subscriptions. So we built a mechanism online that allowed you to generate this material. You picked the color, you picked the message, you downloaded it, it was ready to share online or to print. So it's interesting to me, I guess, in some ways, that this is the inverse of what I'm talking about sort of elsewhere, where the stuff that lives only on the screen, where production and consumption is all in that same little flattened space. Here, the brand, the thing itself was very real and very much existed out in the world. But it was only made possible via digital means. And in that sense, the digital experience was the only way that this was given an opportunity to have meaning. The final thing I'm going to talk about is Threadable, which is an iOS app. Threadable is a reading, a social e-reader, where you and a small circle of friends or family can read the same books, comment on the books, or follow along with expert guides. Products for me are really interesting. Nowhere is it so clear that the thing you use is the brand as in a digital product. It is just one-to-one. There is no other. Everything exists within this space. So the decisions that you're making here are decisions that impact not just how it works, but how I think of it. So in this instance, this is where I'll talk a little bit about the smushiness and how we work. Upstatement is sort of unique in that, from what I've seen, compared to other agencies, we don't really have roles clearly defined. There's a number of people who are pretty smart and pretty skilled and do multiple things and slide in and out of roles on a project. so that the designers here, one of those designers is a very capable coder. One of those engineers thinks a lot about user experience. The project lead, Tito, is a strategist and a writer sometimes, or a designer. The project manager, Caroline, is like, half of what she's doing here is making sure that the content and the writing is all correct and on par. I think this contributes to a better end result than something that is more clearly defined. In part because it is purposefully inefficient. It is built to restructure itself based on what the thing is. And so in this case, you have this like iOS product that's very interfacey. It needs a group of people who are going to think about user experience in a different way than that Michelle Wu team, who is thinking much more about the kind of surface quality of like, what's this brand going to be? It needs that kind of sliding back and forth. It's also, for a product, man, it's so iterative. Product work, okay, the Michelle Wu thing was 6 weeks. MIT was probably like 6 to 8 months. This thing is like a year and a half and it's still going. It's real, by the way, it's in the store. It's not like we're just working. It's just that when you have something like this, you're continuously iterating on it. You're building it, you're testing it, you're seeing what happens, you build it again. So how then, if it's so iterative, if the thing is like you try to release it and then continue, how do you build a brand around this thing? How do you like know what it's going to be and how it should speak? So in this instance, we took this approach of starting with brand ideas and letting them guide the function of the app, which I laugh at because it seems silly, but it's also very useful. Because what we wanted was to get at something that wasn't so much that we had an idea about like this is exactly what it's going to do. It was more like, oh, we had an idea that this is how it's going to feel. It's going to feel like a thing where you and your friends are able to share this book between one another. And so given that, let's try to brand the final outcome and see which one feels right. So there's these 4 different ideas here, 4 different these are each like a hypothetical marketing site, like that you might encounter once the thing had launched. This is very early on. Each of which was for sort of a different product. And the idea was like, which one makes you feel this certain way? Which one is compelling that you want to send it to your friends and so that they download it and that you read together? And they each had little more than a headline and description. And over time, those things got narrowed. There's a bunch of hypothetical, like this was like the exercise basically to determine what the product was to first try to speak about the way that it worked, the way that it felt, and sort of hone in on something. And there were these 3 ideas at the end. You could read a book with friends, like a virtual like reading club. You could read a book with expert commentary, which is sort of like a director's cut. Or you could read a book that had these threads between texts that you could follow so that you're thinking a little bit more about the stuff that like connects ideas. And they all were like, those were the things that we kept coming back to. But of those things, only one of them we could build quickly, which was going to be reading with friends. That is the easiest thing to build, and so that's what we built first. Everything else is going to come. But like the key experience, that feeling of reading with friends, that sort of that brand idea, I should just say the idea drove what the product would be and how the product got built. And how to avoid frustration in this space, like, okay, the idea here, the brand here, is not about the beige, and it's not about the lines, the teal. It is about the way that you read and share. Like, that is the idea. And then everything else is sort of stacked on top of that, including decisions about UI. Decisions about how the interface works obviously affect the like purpose and meaning of the app. Like, what's it for? How are you going to use it? This animation of a page turning on the left, which was early iOS, iBooks or whatever it was called, it fundamentally changed the way that people read books. Like, it changed the way that a book felt to you. It felt, this is a personal thing, so I'm sort of speaking of my own experience and expression, but it felt really slow. It did not, it was so beholden to this like idea of a book that it was not a book. And it was a very aggressive intervention. And I think this question of like how you make interventions, the interventions you make into default, into the thing as like a very plain, like let's strip away all affect. The interventions you make have far more impact on the meaning of the thing or on the brand than color and type do. Color and type you can swap in and out all day. But until it really turns that dial way up and it feels like an aggressive intervention, it does not impact the idea or the experience itself. And in the case of Threadable, this is the last slide, by the way. I should I feel like I should always prep people when I'm about to end. The interventions that we made are very few, but they were significant. They were about how you read and about how content was created. And in fact, it's like we spent most of the time thinking about how are people going to have a better editorial experience with this than we did thinking about what it would look like. The look-like thing is in some ways secondary. You want it to be welcoming. But man, the question of how it worked determined everything about this, and it determined, I think, what the idea of the product would be. Stepping forward, like this became more about a thing that got shared in a social space than it was about an e-reader, and a lot of that stuff came from that original idea of like how we wanted it to feel. The product and the brand in this sense really are one and the same. There is no other brand. There's no like, here's the like brand book that exists outside of the app. It is entirely this. I really appreciate it. This is my closing slide. Thank you very much.
Questions are welcome about, I mean, you gave us a nice broad arc of experiences. I'm curious, like, what are you working on now since you've been there for about a year? What